Hi, my name is Marilyn, Zakhour. I'm the founder and CEO of Cosmic Centaurs, and we help leaders, organizations, and teams adapt to the new ways of working in the emerging post-pandemic world. Welcome to our second session of our second yearly Cosmic Conference on the future of teams, where we are exploring team dynamics in distributed settings. As always, we're here on LinkedIn Live and Facebook Live today and tomorrow. This is our second panel. There are 4 more amazing panels, including a debate and 2 team workshops on rituals and identity. Please do sign up for them on our website. And of course, given that this is a big sports metaphor, we want our fans to be cheering on the players. So please do ask all of your questions. We will make sure that we get to them. And the team, the Centaurs, are looking for the nicest question that someone's going to ask, the trickiest question that they're going to ask, and we'll make sure that you win a really beautiful virtual experience for your team. And so without further ado, let's get this game started. Hi, everybody. How are you doing?
Pretty good.
Very good.
Very excited to have you. Let me give you a quick introduction then. As you would have seen, this session on the Future of Teams conference is about what we can learn from sports and esports teams. If you've ever watched a sports team react when they win a big game or tournament, players celebrate, ice buckets happening, teams rushing to the field. It's a beautiful moment. And it always reminds us that, success is driven by collaboration. And recently also we were reminded that sports teams are also a great place to observe leadership. You might know what I'm referring to, the match in the Euro 2020 when Christian Eriksen from Denmark team had to be revived by medics, and the captain of the team, Simon Kjærs, I really hope I didn't mess up his name, his leadership really shone through. We all saw him bring in all the other players, create protection, and also go and comfort the player's partner. It was really such a beautiful moment of leadership. And so joining me today are 2 incredible team captains, and there we go. Maddie's with us too. Welcome, Maddie. I was having a mini heart attack, but I'm glad you made it.
Hi.
Hi. So joining me are 2 team captains. I'm going to introduce Maddie and Sammy in a minute. So we'll start with them. Sammy, I've had the pleasure of working with before. He played on his university basketball team. He founded and played in a rugby team. And he even founded a championship-winning endurance racing team. He spent 18 years in marketing, including numerous roles at Mimac Ogilvy before moving to his current role as Senior Business Marketing and Communications Director at TikTok. But we're mostly interested in his sports experience. So leave your TikTok questions for another conference. Also joining us is Maddie. She's known, using her gamer name. Maddie, she's the first Pakistani female to pursue esports professionally as a career, and she is the team captain for the first all-female MENA League of Legends at UAE's leading esports organization, Galaxy Racer Esports. And I'm also really incredible to introduce what I call the coaches. So Tom Marsden, he's the CEO of Saberr, a software company with the mission of transforming teamwork. Saberr is a digital platform designed to nudge leaders and teams into routines and habits that help them develop great teams. And then last but not least, we're joined by Evelyn, who's a PhD researcher at the University of York under the Center for Doctoral Training in Intelligent Games and Game Intelligence. And her research focuses on team dynamics in virtual teams and specifically with online competitive team-based games. Are you guys ready to start the game today?
Let's do it.
Brilliant. I have a brilliant team. I love this. All right, let me start off. Sammy, maybe I'll start off with you. And this is a question that I really want all of you to answer from your varying perspectives. Sammy, what makes a great team?
I think the answer seems quite obvious, but it's getting into the guts of the answer that is quite hard, right? So for me, it's on 3 fundamentals. You need to have a shared objective, and it's not obviously as a sports person, winning is the objective, but it's the strategy by which you go about it. Understanding what's going to get you to winning has to be super clear, and I think super simple. I think we over-science it so often. I think we keep it simple and people can buy into that. The second one is communication. And one thing that frustrates me when I go to my desk job is that communication is often this really kind of soft thing. You've got to be really nice and all about the sandwich thing. Whereas when you get into a sports environment, it's all about like candid, clear, concise communication. Tell someone what you think, tell them what you need, and they understand that really well. And the last one, which I don't think we talk often enough about, is trust. This underlying trust that you are the right person to do your job. I am the right person to do my job on a team. I'm not here to question that. I'm here to deliver what I've been asked to do. You're here to deliver what you've been asked to do, and I trust that you're going to do it. So those are the three core elements, if you were to ask me.
Yeah, I really love that. And the fact that sports allows you to be very straightforward about these things. Evelyn, I saw you react to this piece around, no bullshit communication. Tell us, what makes great teams from your perspective, and what makes great teams in the teams that you study?
So as you're asking that question, I was kind of thinking about the kind of teams, right? So if you have a short-term team or a long-term team, then the things that makes those two teams work are slightly different. Obviously, the core is still the same, having a clear purpose, having a clear goal. That's 100% for any team, no matter what kind of team it is. But yeah, in the teams I look at, so I look at mostly ad hoc teams of strangers, one-off, virtual, like usually 100% anonymous. It's really important that everyone knows their roles and carries it out. But more importantly, at least for competitive games, you have to be 100% a team player. If you're even a little bit selfish, the team just falls 100%. But it will be different in the workplace because you see the person, you have an ongoing relationship, there is a shadow of the future. So in that case, even if you're a bit of a dick, you can afterwards say, yeah, I'm sorry for doing that. Let's try and work something out.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful point, that piece of, quote unquote, game theory. Maddie, I saw you nodding when Evelyn was saying you really have to be a team player. Talk to us about your own experience in your team.
I agree with everything she said, but I feel like when it comes to esports a little bit, when a person has earned the right to be just very tiny bit selfish, it's okay. And your team your team members kind of have to put that trust in. And that person kind of has to prove themselves. They have another chance on proving themselves that they deserve the right to be selfish or not. I feel like that happens in my team a lot because we all have such great members, team players, and you revolve the game around one person and you just put that trust in and they live up to it. So it feels good to give someone that trust.
Tom, you and I spoke about some of the elements that we know make a great team. We spoke about the fact of having shared values, and I loved your perspective on that. So according to you, what makes great team?
Well, I was going to agree massively with Sammy in terms of his 3 points, to be honest. But I mean, I would add another dimension, which is you need diverse thinking. You need cognitive diversity. You need people who are coming at the problem from a different perspective. Because that's what enables kind of breakthrough innovation, particularly for solving a complex problem. I think what's interesting about the values is what we found in our research. If people don't have some alignment of values or an ability to kind of have tolerance for each other's values, then sometimes that diverse thinking can be kind of conflicting as opposed to sort of being reinforcing. So it's an interesting, I think, two things I would advocate. One is you want diverse thoughts, but you want tolerance to understand where people are coming from as well.
Yeah, and I think maybe you guys can share stories around that. Tom, you had shared a really beautiful story about two colleagues who had very divergent values around authority and how they came to understand each other around them.
Yeah, no, that was an amazing piece of work we did with a company a few months ago where we found, one of the things we do to try and unpack people's values is we ask them to do a little kind of values profiling to understand give them a language to talk about where their values are coming from. Yeah. And one of the conflicts that we sometimes see is people who value autonomy and being able to work and get things done on their own, and people who value kind of more of power, and value being able to influence through power. And we had this conflict in a team, and we asked them, well, where do that kind of those beliefs come from? And the person who valued kind of having some sort of power to influence shared an incredibly personal story about sort of a very difficult teenage years where he'd lost friends through drugs. He'd actually had someone died. And then he kind of basically got his life back by going into the army and having a sort of structure and a discipline to work through. And no one had any idea about this, but he said, this is why I like a little bit of structure in my life, and then the person who valued autonomy gave an equally incredibly personal story about sort of growing up in a communist era where his father was taken away from the secret police when he was 7. And he said, I have a real problem with authority because ever since then. And just this sharing of people's history just suddenly enabled them to understand a little bit better where they were coming from. So I think there are lots of different ways, values come to life, but being able to kind of disclose a little bit about your story can be a really powerful way to uncover it.
Sami, I saw you reacting to that.
No, I just think it's really interesting when you talk about values and how they can be, like you said, by divergent values. It's what I find is the expression that came to mind is having the right person for the role rather than the right person for the role versus the right person that fits that role. And it's something in the race team we struggled with a lot, because regardless of, I'll get into a later question about the ego of being a racing driver and kind of touching on Evelyn's point. You have to be completely self-centric and believe you're the best driver on the planet for survival, even though I'm not, and I'll put that out there, I'm far from it. But what with the rest of the team, a race team can, it's about 20 people. And for many years, we had pretty much the same group of people. And when we got into that really in space, we started to realize that it was down to literally the mindset of each of those people and what they felt their role was on that team. And you had people that were incredibly critical. Their job is to put a tire on the car. And that doesn't sound like a big job, but 15 seconds later, I'm going to be doing 250 kilometers an hour. I pretty much hope that tire is still going to be on the car then. So it's an important job. And if I'll give you one perfect example. We had one guy, and he felt that getting that tire on quicker than everybody else was his objective. So he had this thing where he was competing with all the other guys. And we realized very quickly that mindset was completely wrong. It was about getting it done right within the time frame required, not being the hero in that moment. And that kind of lends itself to what you were saying, Tom. That's why I kind of build on that. I think it's really important to have the right person for the role, not just the right person to fit that role, if you know what I mean.
And I think one of the beauties of sports is there's a clear objective usually, which is winning, that galvanizes people. And so I think that one of the things, if we talk with when people do have different values, is kind of how can we create a shared objective that we're trying to achieve? And I think in gaming or in sports, the objective is often very clear. We're trying to win. So it's in that respect, I think there's a natural advantage to kind of creating team identity, but there are different ways of winning, clearly.
Yeah, but I think this is all right. So I'll digress if I may, Marilyn. So here's an interesting question I ask people, right? So I do endurance racing, 24-hour races. Just to put in the picture, it's like 4 drivers, a team, etc. And the most people I ask, what does it take to win a 24-hour race? And they'll say, well, be the quickest, right? That's natural. You're winning a race. You've got to be quicker. Yeah. And in the story I'm going to tell later about failure and success, one thing that really shone for us is it doesn't actually matter how fast you go. It doesn't say anywhere in the rules that you have to be quick. It says you have to complete more laps than any other car. And that's what I mean by understanding your real objective. If you slice and dice the concept of winning and making it so simple, fine, I get that. Yeah, we wanted to win, we wanted to beat the other teams. But when you start to take it one tier below that and understand what that actually means, it becomes a lot easier to build a strategy and a team to achieve that objective. Our objective was always to complete more laps. We didn't talk about winning. Our objective was to complete more laps than any other car. And by doing that, you win the race.
Yeah, that also speaks to measuring the right things and focusing on the right things. I think that's a very insightful point. And I wonder, Madiha, we have a question from the audience, but it also aligned with a question that I wanted to ask you. And Sami, I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well, about how you translate what you've learned in sports teams into not only work, but into distributed teams. But Maddie, since you run a distributed team anyway, right? Like e-gamers, obviously you're not sitting together. One question in the audience is, for example, if you've ever been in a situation where you did, something selfish and had to regain trust, and what steps you took to regain them. And some of the questions I had for you also around that is, talk to us what it's like leading a team when you're not physically together. What are some of the ways in which you guys create, a team dynamic and maintain a healthy culture? It seems so comparable to remote work that, we really need to hear it from somebody who's done it so naturally for so long.
Sure. So I remember before the pandemic started, we were actually practicing for the biggest female esports tournament that happened in Dubai, and we were together every day for like 8 to 10 hours, and it was not easy. So bringing on the answer to your question is, now that we've been practicing online for about a year, more than a year, I can say it's much easier, but the only thing that comes really difficult is what Sami said earlier, is communication. When you're in front of someone, I feel like you're more forced to communicate how you feel and put everything there is in your mind out there. But when you're online, I feel like communication isn't that clear. You kind of have to ask the person like 2 times, and you develop a really personal connection in esports, because you're spending numerous amounts of hours with that person. You kind of have to make it fun in order for you to last that many hours together. So
what are some of the ways in which you guys kind of introduce fun? Are you constantly communicating with each other at the same time?
So we have our group. It's like any other job really. I would compare it to like a marketing job, where people in marketing are probably sharing like different marketing campaigns other companies did. So we're comparing like what other teams did, what kind of strategy they use. And if it's not about gaming, we'll talk, to be honest, it's all about gaming most of the time, but we're all girls. So we'll talk about makeup or like, normal stuff, what concerts we've been to, random stuff really. But it's almost always about gaming. If not the game, we're playing another game.
Yeah, I appreciate that. But also I think the makeups and the concerts, those are, you can refer to a concept called mutual knowledge, which is that teams perform better when they know details about each other as individuals. And so it's not as silly as it sounds. Evelyn, you focus, as you mentioned earlier, on teams that form on a temporary basis. And that's a very extreme case. But also earlier, Mark was talking about the fact that even before the pandemic, there was an epidemic of loneliness, because in organizations, we are spending less and less time in a stable team. And that's leading us to kind of have no anchor, no home room, as he called it. Tell us a little bit about how teams cope with that and how they manage to continue winning, so to speak.
So I think if you're a regular player playing on temporary team all the time, you don't have that personal connection with, you just don't. And you don't intend on building it. And so most players go into these games with no intention of actually building a friendship with the person that they're playing with. Friendships are built mostly offline, or if you're playing different kinds of games. So the kind of games I look at, they are match-based and they're competitive. So one round is 45 minutes and then you swap everybody. But if you're, say, playing what's it called? World of Warcraft, for example. If you play those games, those are like high longevity kind of games where you tend to see the same people after a while, or it's beneficial to join a guild or a clan. So in those kind of situations where there is part of the gameplay is actually continued repeated interactions, that's where friendships will be built. But for most players going into match-based games, there is no intention to build friendships. If they do happen spontaneously, either because maybe they're on voice comms in an FPS and suddenly they hear someone cracking a joke about something that they also know about, then it goes back to that mutual knowledge, like, hey, you also know that thing that I know about, so we both find it funny, and then they connect on a thing beyond the game. So those are the rare moments, but it does happen. If you go on Reddit and search on like gamer friendships or like gamer relationships, people do end up meeting their partners online and getting married and all that. It's extreme, but it does happen. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Sami, there's a question in the audience from Peter. He says, since COVID forced us to spend the majority of our time avoiding other human beings, did you take your driving skills online? And if so, which game?
I wish. I do play a little bit, nowhere near as professionally as Maddie would. It became super popular, and all of my My pro driver friends were all doing it. It just, frankly, the simulator to be competitive was a bit too expensive for my liking. I saved the money to go racing again. So I'll be back in a race car in the real world in September. So I'm looking forward to that.
So talk to us a little bit. You did kind of talk about it in your answer to my first question, but talk to me a little bit more. I really think there's something quite, I don't know if you should call it simple, but something quite simple about a sports team that you could take these learnings and bring them forward, maybe on the other side of what you do for a living, which is on a more corporate side. What learnings do you carry forward from your experience in competitive sports that you want to share with us?
I think there's a couple, right? I did a presentation internally about this the other day. So if I was to make it super simple, there's 4 things that jump out at me, right? The first one is, like I've said already, really understand your objectives. Second one is about clear communications and knowing your role. The third one is about knowing your strengths as a team and double down. And I'll explain that one in a minute. And the third one is that momentary self-glory doesn't compare to winning. And this for a racing driver is like the biggest thing, right? There's nothing I love more than a perfect lap on the absolute limit. You're doing 105%, and that car is dancing, and it's just, everything is just a hair away from going wrong. That's perfect, right? But in a race team, that doesn't work because that's too high risk. When you're doing a 24-hour race, when you're qualifying, you're on the limit, you want the best time. When you're over 24 hours, we run to a delta time, which is usually at about 95 to 97% of where we should be. And the reason for that is that everything else is supposed to work. The car needs to last 24 hours. The driver needs to stay healthy. You're in the car for 2 hours. And as a driver with that ego that we were talking about earlier, Evelyn, you have to kind of swallow that. And every lap you have to remind yourself to go, yeah, there's a team, this is a team game. And that's how we as a team ended up winning, was that we really bought into that concept of the wider team. So that's the first thing. I think clear communications, if I can, I'll give you like a 2-minute analogy of what a race team is versus an office, right? So if you can imagine a pit stop during a 24-hour race, I'm stood there, I'm about to get in the race car, I have my helmet on and I'm psyched and I've just listened to Thunderstruck and I'm ready to go. And the guy and the strategy guy, and we all have these in companies, right? The guy who runs the strategy, he sits on the pit wall and he goes box, 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 box this lap, which means pit. Great. So the car comes in, the car parks. The guy who's driving the car has been in the car for 2 hours, jumps out. I jump in. He does my seatbelts for me. I don't touch anything. I sit there. 4 other guys are doing the wheels. They've done that. There's a guy with a lollipop. He lifts it, and I leave. And like I said, 15 seconds later, I'm doing 250 kilometers an hour, and everything works. And I'm gone for 2 hours. Now, put yourself in the office environment. And I'll only stop at the second moment, right? So the first moment is strategy guy. Pit this lap. Are you sure? Like, have we really thought this through? You missed the pit, like you're done, right? But that's his job. He's paid to do that. That's what we do. We sit there, go, are you sure you've got this strategy right? You jump in the car, the guy's doing your belt buckles. What do? You look at, well, I've done this before myself. Do you need some help? Can I do this for you? That's exactly what we do. And this is why I get so frustrated at work, because I'm like, dude, I've asked you, like, you have the job you have because you're capable of doing the job. That's why you're there. So go do your job. Like, yes, we have to communicate as a team. We're going to win as a team. But your job is to do the strategy. Your job is to make sure those tires are right. Your job is to drive. Like, that's your job. Stop questioning each other. Stop getting in each other's way, because that's how we took, we used to do this pit stop in, I think it was our average over the season was 27 seconds. And everybody else on the grid was doing it in circa 55 to a minute. Now, you do that over the course of a 24-hour race. You can do the maths yourselves very quickly, but basically we were saving 5 laps a race just by being efficient, stationary. So we won races by being stationary. Like, this is like the most mind-blowing thing we ever figured out. So yeah, that's my analogy for a team, and that's what I take it to work. Right? Whenever I go and speak to people in an office, I'm like, I don't have time to communicate for 15 minutes when I need to talk. Like, it's simple.
I have a question for you, Sammy. So how did you actually get to that stage of, like, at some point, I'm going to tell you to do this and you're just going to do it because you trust that I know what I'm doing. I'm sure, you didn't get there overnight. No,
I wouldn't say overnight. I mean, it was a couple of years of learning, many races of failing massively. And I'll read you a quote if I can that really, so after 2014, I'll tell you the story later, massive failure, lots of tears. It was terrible. But I went and I watched the documentary, and I found this quote in a documentary by a guy called Alan McNish. He's not a scholar, he's a racing driver. He's a 4-time world champion. He's won Le Mans 3 times. And he goes, I personally don't believe in luck. I think luck is an excuse for people who have failed in their mission to do something. If you do your preparation correctly, if you do the work, if you think about certain things and make the correct judgment on all the risks that you're going to take, and you stay out of the pits, you win the race. That's not luck, that's hard work. And frankly, that statement was the galvanizing moment for us when we realized that we need to assess every little detail. All we did before was worry about the driver, the hero, right? I've got the ego. I've got to drive very fast, and that's all we cared about. And then when we shifted that to caring about the team unit and how that's going to create a winning environment, that's when it changed.
I think that's really incredible. And I wonder, Tom, you know, with Saberr, and of course with all the research and the work that you do on the side of it, you spend a lot of time trying to deconstruct for teams, right? What are the ingredients? What are the rituals? What are the conversations? How do we build trust? We have questions in the audience, you know, one of them from May around how do you build vulnerability? A question from Gabriella about aligning mindsets. And I feel that Saberr is quite good at actually breaking this down into pieces that teams have to become progressively good at. Like Sammy was saying, it's not just the driver. Like, let's say that over the last year, we spent a lot of time worrying just about psychological safety, but there are so many other pieces that also have to work really well for things to come together. So talk to us about your perspective on the things that teams have to get right.
Well, I think, yeah, I think what Sammy's saying is very true, which is, I mean, and this idea you've got to break down what winning is. You've got to break it down into the component parts. What is it going to take to win? And I think, you know, for a team in the workplace, one of the things we've recognized is there are certain kind of routines, habits, and rituals that good teams do generally in terms of working on themselves. So forget about the subject you're working on. You know, there are things like taking the time to invest to be really clear on your purpose and the goals you're having as a shared kind of collective team is a really important thing to do in the workplace. And often there are individual goals, but the team haven't invested the time to get really, really clear on what are our shared objectives, you know. Coming up with some ground rules about how we're going to communicate with each other so that you've got some really clear ground rules around what that looks like. What does good communication look like? How do we want feedback? You know, those kind of things that are tailored to individuals. Carving out regular time that's scheduled to reflect on how things are working. You know, so, you know, how do we, like agile retrospectives is a classic case of a ritual that is really working extensively globally for many teams. It's a great thing, just having the space to say what's working well, what's not working well. And what we're finding is even if a team hasn't got much to say, just having the space to do it, normalizing that conversation is a great activity. So I think there are a whole range of routines that teams can get into, which will just make them healthier, you know. And I mean, if you'll excuse me, one analogy as a Brit right now, one of the routines that I think the English football team have worked out they need to get better at is penalty taking. You know, so they've been practicing penalty taking, thank God, which, you know, because that was part of winning that they hadn't really worked out before. So I think understanding what it takes to win and breaking that down and working on the team as much as working on the subject you're trying to address and getting those routines in place is really important, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. Sami and Mari, I have a question for the two of you. I'd love to hear, you know, Sami, maybe we can start with you. And you talked about the fact that for a long time you were losing before you started winning, right? I'd love for you to talk to us about how you overcome loss collectively. What's a scenario that maybe you were the cause of the poor performance? I don't know if that was ever the case, Sami, I'm not sure, but maybe it was. But how did you deal with it together as a team? You know, I actually asked someone to come and give us a coaching session as a team in Cosmic. And one of the feedbacks that Suzanne gave me, so she's the coach who was helping us, at the end is there was a moment where someone said something and it created, you know, a moment where we were dealing with something that wasn't perfect. And one of the really beautiful things she said is, your team is very good at reforming, you know, like you got a shock and you all had to deal with it. And then you all really did that job. You all really addressed it together. Maybe talk to us about the years before you started winning.
Yeah, I think it was in 2014. It was, I know the exact moment. It was January the 15th, 2014. It was, let me get this right. It would have been 11:45 in the morning on a Saturday. We were, it was our fourth year in a row at the Dubai 24 Hours, and we were 30 laps ahead of second place. So we were killing it. And it was 2 hours and 20 minutes to go the race, or 2 hours and 30 minutes. And the car just stopped. That was it. It stopped. And it was the fourth year in a row that we had been leading and something had gone wrong. And I remember somebody came up to me and went, man, hard luck, that's just racing. And I've never been more pissed off with any human being in my life. Because I just couldn't comprehend it. I was like, that just 4 years, like, no, 4 years, that doesn't do it. So we had a really interesting moment where this team of people that have been trying so hard and got to this point, and they were really good. We were really, really good. Half of them went, like, I can't go through this heartbreak again. And half of them went, how are we going to fix this? And I basically, one of the core things I did was identify the two people that were going to galvanize this rebuilding. And I pulled them over to my house the next day. And that's when we addressed this whole thing about what does it take to win. We're doing something wrong. We have to do something wrong. You don't lose 4 times in a row and not say you're doing something wrong. So I think the biggest thing for me was identifying those people that are going to help rebound. You're going to have naysayers. You're going to have people that take defeat harder than others, and you're going to have those that are going to help prop up and galvanize the rest of the team. And everybody will eventually jump back on board. The second thing was we had to do something different, right? We couldn't just say we're going to show up next year. I promise you everything's going to be different. We had to approach everything different and communicate it clearly. So going back to communication. So everybody on the team, it sounds really silly, but these guys all fly in, right? So when they arrived the next year, they had branded T-shirts waiting in their hotels. They had phones so they could call home. They had an agenda of what was going to happen at home. We professionalized every detail of what we were doing. This was no longer just me, my brothers, and a friend going racing. This was dual racing. We're here to win. And I kid you not. So from the following January, we top 3, so podium, 9 races, endurance races in a row, and won 2 championships in a row. So there was a dramatic shift, and I think it was the other thing I talk about is we addressed everything. So my wife and my brother's wife are the catering, and what do they have to do? They have to feed you. Like, it's not, you're talking about a race team. That can't be the most important thing. It suddenly became the most important thing. The physio became the most important thing. The guys who were doing they became the most important thing, because we realized that it takes every piece of that puzzle to make this work. And that was basically the moment.
Yeah, no, I think that's a beautiful story. And some of what you said reminds me of this quote. I don't know if you guys are familiar, I'm sure maybe, with the Stockdale paradox. It's a long story, but something that you said about facing the brutal facts just reminded me of this quote. I'll read it out. You must never confuse faith that you'll prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever it may be. And I think, Sam, something beautiful that you guys did as a team was you didn't say, oh, it's the market, like what we would do. Oh, the market went down, or there was a pandemic. You said, no, there must be something wrong, and we're going to methodically look at every little thing so we figure it out. And to Tom's story around rituals and observing together what we're not doing right as a team, there has to be a willingness to kind of observe those things and speak them out loud. Maddie, how about you? How do you guys do it when you lose? What's your process for recovering from that?
I think at first it's a lot of emotion, a lot of emotion. But thankfully we have a wonderful staff who always make sure, all players have good mental moving forward. But we have lost in the past, and how we deal with it is basically just reviewing our games over and over again and seeing what went wrong, what could have gone better, strategies moving forward. And I think just realizing that even though this is the biggest thing I would say that gave me like a mental shift when I moved into esports as a career, is even though it's a fun job, you have to give it your all seriousness. And it's very new in the region. So a lot of younger people, I'm a bit older now, but a lot of younger people don't understand that. It's not just a cool job. You can't give it your bare minimum and expect to keep your job. You have to keep trying your best. And it really shows when you lose who's not been putting their full effort in or who's been slacking off. So this is just a talk like me with the coach might have, or coach to player, or manager to player. That's really how we move forward.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I have a question to Tom and Evelyn about managing conflict. It's one thing to manage failure. I wonder, especially being distributed, what are some of the ways in which you guys look at managing conflict? We recently ran a research study. We'll be publishing it hopefully next week. And of course, no surprise there, 60% of respondents think that face-to-face is the only way to manage conflict. And yet we are now thrown into environments where we're going to be distributed or remote for a very long time. Tom, what's your best advice on how to achieve that?
I think the first thing is to kind of reframe conflict as something bad to something different. So there is good conflict, there is good tension. And I think we've heard a lot from Mark's session earlier around the importance of psychological safety in a team and how important that is. But the other half of what Amy Edmondson talks about is psychological safety needs high standards where you're holding each other to account and you're challenging each other as well. And I think you only get to those high standards if you're willing to have conflict, if you're willing to challenge each other robustly. And so I think the first thing is reframe conflict. I think the second thing I would say is just carve out the time to be able to discuss things. And, maybe sometimes it's not such a bad thing that we have a little bit of time to reflect on our anger before we come and meet it in the room. We've got this fast brain thinking that wants to kind of smash someone's head. But actually, if we take some time to think, calm down, reflect, and then meet a bit later and talk about it, that's not a bad thing. So whilst I would definitely say, there are advantages to being able to deal with conflict face-to-face. I think it would be crazy to deny that there aren't. I think there are also advantages to dealing with conflict in a remote setting. And it's like, Matt, how do you get the most out of it? So those are two suggestions.
Yeah, actually, I recorded a podcast. I'm a co-host of a podcast called Who Run the World. We recorded a podcast about conflict because I come from a culture where conflict, especially coming from a woman, is an incredibly shunned upon thing. Like, you do not engage in conflict or you're called a troublemaker. And it's a lot about resetting our mindset. I think that conflict in teams and couples and relationships are a sign of love, because they're a sign that you're willing to be in this conversation as opposed to just walking away from it, which possibly is a lot easier, especially in remote settings. And so I think conflict is actually a very beautiful thing, and it's what leads to dialogue and growth. And I really love that thought of reframing it. Evelyn, how have you seen that through your work? What's your best advice about managing conflict?
Well, you and Tom have kind of touched on pretty much everything, so I've kind of run out of things to say. but I think one of the things that, at least in the virtual setting, that seems to be pretty important is setting norms. So this is the way that we're going to handle this, and we expect everybody to behave according to these norms. So when it comes to conflict, it would be things like how would, if we have a conflict situation, do I talk about the person or do I talk to the person? So maybe in this group setting, I recently I work part-time as a mental coach for an esports team in Singapore. So fully virtual for me because they're there and I'm here. And we had a session where they would give each other feedback. And the key thing I told them is you guys need to talk to each other and not talk about each other. So they, for example, say things like, oh yeah, Tom is blah, 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 blah. And I was like, no, direct it to Tom. And he's like, okay, Tom, you are blah, 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 blah. And that kind of starts to build that culture of let's start having that actual honest conversations about what's working and what's not working. So that's sort of a first step of that is the norm. The norm is we talk to people, not talk about people, for example. And you can do that in virtual teams, anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really great, even on Miro, there's a lot of great canvases actually for team norms. Like, you don't even have to invent all of this. If anyone's interested in doing that, I had to do that when I did to do my executive MBA. I was assigned to a team, and we were going to go through leadership coaching throughout the whole year. And in fact, it was imposed on us that we would create team norms. And to your point, the first time we got into conflict, we kind of went back to that paper that we didn't take very seriously in the beginning. We're like, how did we agree we would deal with this again? And we also had norms like we had to have fun, or Maddie mentioned a norm like this is still a job. You know, there's a lot of these things that we assume, or we think it's not worth it to say them out loud, but they're the kind of first principles of this teamwork. And if we don't make them explicit, they can take years before an actual conversation occurs around them. A couple more questions from the audience, and then I do want to take us to our rapid fire round too. Gabriella asked something around politics, and I think that's another really interesting one. How do you manage team dynamics when you notice that politics are creeping in? Maybe Sammy or Maddie, you guys want to take it. I want to understand how that happens in a system that is not as covered with things as the corporate world.
I think it goes to what Evelyn said, is having a direct to the person candid conversation. So I'll go back to my rugby. I played a little bit of rugby, and I was fortunate enough to be selected to play for the Lebanese national team. Never ended up with the game, but during the training camp, they did something, and the first time they did it, I was like completely horrified, and then I kind of lent into it and realized. So on a daily basis, over dinner, everybody had to pick out the name of somebody in the squad and stand up in front of the entire squad and talk to that person and go, the one thing I wanted more from you today would have been X. And it took away any opportunity to bitch about people behind their backs for the politics, because you had to say it to the person's face. Like, there was no hiding from that. And I think that's how you get rid of politics, is just, and if you are, I think the one thing that I learned really quickly is if you are listening to it, you're complicit to it. Don't think you're innocent. Don't, like, you're not. If you're the guy going, come talk to me about everybody else's problems, come tell me all the gossip, you are just as bad as the person speaking. And you could actually be more toxic in a team than the person that's willing to speak. And you've got to call people out. And I'm very different in a professional setting, just as an athlete. I actually do have all the polite norms. But in a sports setting, you don't have time for it. You just don't. Like,
yeah,
you have 24 hours to win. Like, there's no time for BS.
There's a really great lesson. Maddie, a question from the audience for you. Are there any qualities an esport captain should have that maybe aren't necessarily present in captains of more traditional sports, or maybe in leaders in organizations that you think kind of are unique and that we can learn from?
I guess just really being the one to take the leading step to calling out bullshit when you see it. Like, if you see someone is messing up, and even yourself, by the way, it hurts the most when you have to call out your own mess ups. But if you see like someone is slacking or anything like that, the thing is the coach can watch, but like as a player in the game, when you can feel it, it means more, I feel. So basically just calling that out would be different in a captain.
Yeah. And I think that's also interesting because you're the captain, but you're also a player. And so many leaders are also doing, not just leading, but some aren't. And so I think there's a bit of a different role dynamic over there. I'm going to take us to our rapid fire round, unfortunately, although I really love these lessons. Sadly, I made this joke earlier. None of these trophies are mine. They're actually all Tala's. She gave them to me. I've never been much of a sports person, but I think there is just so much to learn from that world, and I really, really enjoyed our conversation. But let me take you to a rapid fire round. Tom, we'll start with you. I'm going to ask the first question to all of you. So Tom, what's the skill that every leader needs to have today that might have been less important in the past?
Fast teaming, getting teams together, motivated fast.
Excellent. Evelyn, what's your answer?
Being able to read the room. I think kind of like what Mark said earlier about perspective taking. So,
Sammy?
I think a higher level of trust. You're not sitting next to a person. You need to trust that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing when they're doing it.
That's a great point. Maddie, what's yours?
Making sure everyone gets along, I guess.
Yeah, that's pretty damn important. All right, Tom, what's the one book every leader needs to read?
I'd recommend, it's quite dense, but Scott Page's The Difference. Just in terms of understanding how diversity affects teams, and from a really kind of almost mathematical perspective, he takes you through it, and it's fascinating.
Brilliant. Thanks. Evelyn, what's your recommendation?
It's a really good book called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. He follows lots of teams in the real world and ties it back to like the science behind why those teams work. So he follows the Navy and like Pixar and Antonio Hotspurs and how all their successes tie back to things that we know from the science of how teams work well.
Very cool. Sammy, what's your book recommendation?
It's a guy called Sir Clive Woodward, who was a rugby coach that took England to the World Cup final. He wrote an autobiography called Winning. And the reason I love it is because he was an incredibly successful rugby player, an incredibly successful businessman, and then an incredibly successful coach. And he beautifully ties all three together.
Brilliant. Maddie, what's yours?
Can I say a game everyone needs to play instead?
Yes,
I haven't read in a while. RuneScape. RuneScape is good. You learn a lot.
That's a good one.
To your point, Sammy, I have a book here that I finished a couple of weeks ago, if I may add my own, called The $1 Trillion Coach, of someone who started being a coach and then became a businessman and then became a coach to all of the great Silicon Valley CEOs and teams. He was a team coach, which is really wonderful. Okay, over to our next question then. What is the perfect song to work to or to play to, in your case, Maddie? We can start with Tom again. We'll do the rounds.
I actually don't work to music. I love music. I cook to music. I do lots of things to music, but I don't work to music. So but I love the sound of nature when I'm working. And in the UK, that normally means rainfall.
Beautiful.
And birds.
And birds.
And birds. That's totally true. Rainfall
They're right
and birds.
there behind you.
They accompany me the best when I'm working. Yeah.
Beautiful. Evelyn, what's yours?
Mine would be FKJ's Lang Lang EP. I don't know if anyone knows FKJ's, but like atmospheric chill.
We're about to find out. We're going to put it in the Spotify playlist and share it with everyone. Sammy, what's yours?
In the spirit of today and the racing thing, Thunderstruck, AC/DC, ready to go.
Good classic. Maddie, what do you listen to when you're playing?
A bit of everything. More modern stuff like Ariana Grande or Dua Lipa. It's a go-to gamer starter pack.
Yeah, I mean, I have a certain kind of task, especially when I have to do presentations where nothing besides Beyonce can get me to focus. So I hear you. Tom, what's the perfect team size?
Small. I had a friend who basically said, think of a team like curating a 1970s rock band. You don't need two drummers, you know.
That is brilliant. Oh, that's such a good metaphor. Evelyn, what's the perfect team size?
I think small as well, probably 5, but I'm just pulling that number out of nowhere.
Excellent. Sammy, what's yours?
I'm going to go kind of with what Mark was saying. Not big enough to allow for laziness, and not small enough to be overwhelming. Somewhere in the middle. So, but it all depends. It depends on what the objective is. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Maddie, what's the perfect team size?
I agree with them, but I guess 5 is the right answer because I wouldn't be. My team is 5 members, and I couldn't handle more.
Brilliant. And then our last question of the rapid fire. Tom, complete the sentence with a word. The future of teams is?
Oh, diverse. Complex.
Evelyn?
Mine would be messy, but interesting.
Brilliant. Sammy?
Agile.
Maddie?
Lazy sometimes.
That is probably true. I mean, thanks to a bit of automation, we might all be working less hours in the future. There's no reason to think otherwise.
I think we're also talking of automation. I was wondering whether we will probably have a robot in our team soon, and we should embrace the robot.
I mean, I do hope so. There's a lot of tasks I'd like to delegate, honestly.
Yeah.
And I even feel bad giving them to a human. So maybe a robot, I'd feel a little less kind of guilty. All right, you guys, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to wrap it up for now. You've shared amazing insights and really beautiful stories and also rituals and ways of addressing, safety, trust, conflict, all of those things. A huge thank you also to everyone who asked us questions. There's a bunch more questions for you guys, so go find them in the comments and maybe reply in writing, because we didn't have time to cover all of them. And thanks so much to our amazing players and coaches for joining us today. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.